I'm going to start soon. Still waiting for Bruce. Maybe. Hi, Pablo.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Pascal. Hello, Frédéric, Alexis. So Bruce is not still with us.
Yeah, he just arrived. We still got some time to get a coffee or whatever you need, Pascal. It is probably late in Australia.
It's whiskey time for me. It's not nightcap already.
So maybe after the round table.
Probably.
Hello.
Hi, Bruce.
Nice to see people.
Hi, Bruce. Pablo.
Usually in Toulouse, we got a tradition of being late to meetings. But actually using Zoom, the delay was quite, decreases a bit.
Mm-hmm.
We used to get a quarter late and now it is more than 1-2 minutes.
Good.
Yeah, but it's only, I think it's only because you can enter a meeting and not be there, actually.
Permanently late.
So how GamaDays has been so far?
Yeah, I couldn't attend for today because I got other meetings, but yesterday was very nice. Probably, Alexis, you were there today.
Yeah. I must admit that I'm really impressed actually by the number of different models coming from everywhere, and very diverse applications. We had the U.S. Army yesterday talking about drone simulations. We had of course, a lot of urban and agriculture related or ecological simulations, but many new domains of applications. So I was really impressed actually by how diversely people could use the tool. And it's always great. Problem is that you bear a little bit of responsibility with that. So, I mean,
well, especially when you start talking about US defense, you've got a big liability.
Yeah, but it was unclassified, at least. It was written on the slide. But very interesting. Very interesting. Especially, we see a tendency, which is probably a tendency everywhere in ABM about having more and more complex representations of people and people's behavior, which is
that a good thing, actually?
Yeah, it's a good thing on the one hand, and it makes models a little bit less replicable in different situations. So that's you tend to have biases which are linked to cultures, etc. So anyway, it's another debate.
Well, that's the next hour debate, partially at least.
Well, you'll be disappointed, Alexis. Well, I don't know, because what Nathaniel Hutchinson will present tomorrow is probably the first agent-based model we've created or contributed to that has no one in so far. It's going to come later, but so far it's pure hydrology for the moment.
Yeah, but I'm looking for his presentation actually because I feel alone with my small agents, small simple agents that don't do anything other than bumping into each other. So I'm really interested because I'm working precisely on the fluid dynamics for the moment and trying to reuse some of the C++ libraries used in fluid dynamics in order to interface with Gamma. So I will be, in any case, very interested by
this said, we were quite impressed. We were lucky enough to be able to piggyback on a semi-empirical hydrological model, which always helps rather than getting big libraries of pure deterministic hydrology approaches. But as you know from the abstract, we want to have something which is an operational model for real-time flood prediction. So with 5 minutes windows of prediction, and Gamma is just brilliant for it. I couldn't believe how fast Nate managed to optimize the code. So yeah, congratulations to the coders.
Well, okay, very good to know. I'm always complaining about the speed of the model, so I'm very happy to find people.
We can swallow radar data coming up from the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia every 5 minutes. And for the moment, it's a mock-up, so we don't have the live feed, but we're replicating in vitro the feed, and it works brilliantly.
Impressive, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation tomorrow.
And I'm really jealous because I feel really old because he just said Gamma, what's Gamma? Oh, okay. And a week later, he's he had already programmed most of the models. So.
Okay, so probably we can start. I have to keep track of the schedule, so not be too late. So welcome everybody for this roundtable. It is entitled, "Can we trust models?" Big expectations. Thank you for the 3 participants that I will present shortly right now. So first of all, we welcome Bruce Edmonds, who is Professor of Social Simulation at the Manchester Metropolitan University and Director of the Center of Policy for Policy there. So for more than 30 years, Bruce has been doing social simulation and is interested basically in very diverse fields coming from philosophy, policy use, methodology, and so on and so forth. So welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
Welcome as well to Pablo Jensen, who is Research Director at the CNRS and working at the ENS, École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, in France. So Pablo is a physicist and former director of the Institute of Complex Systems of Lyon. And particularly, he authored at least 1 book. He authored several books, actually, and I liked the first one about the atoms in the coffee. It was very nice. Anyhow, the last book is, in English, it is entitled Your Life in Numbers. It was much more explicit for me in French. The French version I read last year during my summer, actually. It was why you cannot put society into equation, more or less. And so it was quite interesting. And the last participant is Pascal Perez, professor at the University of Wollongong in Australia. He is director of the Smart Infrastructure Facility, Faculty of Engineering, Information Science. And Pascal worked on participatory modeling of complex socio-technical systems for quite a long time, with a lot of very innovating, interesting projects in the domain. So just to welcome to all of 3 and thank you for being available to this roundtable. Just to frame a bit the question of trust in models, or the question, can we trust models? There have been not only a recent actually question about the trust in models related to COVID, but for quite a long time, it has been the question of trusting science. For instance, in the global warming field, how society at large consider those results and considers eventually the models and tools that are used in order to produce those results. And it was especially the case, so more recently with COVID, where there was not so much in society a discussion about models, but rather among modelers in the modeling communities. There have been a lot of discussion about the models that were used actually in order to predict the diffusion, spreading of an epidemics. It was the case, particularly in ABM field, about a lot of question about the model of Ferguson. And well, it was quite interesting. In order to start with, so it was only to frame a bit the discussion. In order to launch now the discussion, I would just like to mention an anecdote. Some years ago, I was participating in a research school, so among scientist colleagues, and we played a game that probably Pascal, you know it, and probably many others of you, that is called fish banks. So you are at the head of fishery. Every player got a fleet of boats, and you're supposed to manage a kind of fishery. And each turn, you have to decide if you want to invest to buy more boats, and how many boats you want to send fishing, actually. So at the very beginning of the game, everything is going well, and you fish as many resources that is available. So you have the tendency to think that everything is going well, so you invest in more boats, you are fishing more and more fishes, that everything is well. And at a moment in the game, you get a decrease in the stock of fish. So you fish less and less fish. And in the game, you get this particular role that is played by a scientist. And the scientist intervened at this moment of the game and told every participant that according to the models used by scientists, the fishing stock is going to decrease very soon. And the reaction of every player, so it was during a research school, so we were among scientists basically and among modelers. The reaction of every player around the table was that, well, models are models, so anyway I'm going to invest more in more boats and going to fish. Okay, and of course, few turns after this, there was no more fish in the sea. And so it led to my first question to the participants. I don't want you to play fish banks really, but as modelers for quite a long time, every one of you, do you trust your own models? Maybe, I don't know, maybe Bruce, you want to start with?
Okay, yes. The short answer is no, I don't trust my own models. In fact, I never find my own models interesting until they confuse me. So this is not very surprising. But it is so easy to fool oneself using a model. Just by the very process of interacting with a model, because it's quite an interactive process, has a very strong effect of changing how you look at the world. In fact, it's typical that the whole world looks exactly like your model for weeks after you've made a new model. Everything looks like your model. And obviously this is not true. And yeah, you find bugs in it, and all the stuff that you'd assumed were interesting effects turn out to be artifacts of various side bits of your model. And so no, you can't trust it. And you can't trust it as an individual researcher unless, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, there are sort of collective ways of comparing, contrasting, critiquing models that other people are checking and critiquing a model, trying to find mistakes with it, trying to find assumptions. And there's this sort of iterative process of comparing and trying models. Then no, you shouldn't trust models. They can be useful in indicating possibilities. For example, possibilities of ways things could go wrong. So current models, for example, about tipping points in climate change, they may be wrong, but they show that it's possible that there might be a whole domino effect of tipping points. And because the risk is so large, then yes, you have to take those to some extent seriously. But where there are complex trade-offs which affect people's lives, then you have to take them with a very big pinch of salt. That's about all I will say to start with.
Thank you. Pablo, you want to
Okay, so yeah, okay, so Bruce already gave many good reasons not to trust models, but to trust, in some sense, we could ask to trust some, I mean, relatively always, of course, a consensus reached by a collective of modelers, when this collective of modelers, of course, is well managed and pluralistic, and okay, so it gives you some confidence that the usual scientific process has been followed. So you can, that's why you can also, I mean, trust, and we should trust IPCC models. I'll give another reason just after, but maybe what I can add are two things. One is that it's easier for me to trust physical models. It's not because I'm a physicist, but because the main reason is that in physics and some other sciences, you can find empirical stabilities, okay? And these are really the foundation of models or of equations or theories, okay? So if you have empirical stabilities, which in climate models are the fact that you have energy conservation, so the energy that comes from the sun has to go somewhere, that you have momentum conservation. So you have some conservation laws in physics which are very, very strong that you can trust even in the future. And this constitutes like a skeleton which prevents simulations, even if they have many degrees of freedom and they are not perfect, but that prevent simulations from going completely wrong, because you have some trustable skeleton, spatially, but also in time. Okay, even in future, we can have a good trust that even in 100 years, the conservation of energy, of momentum will be there. Okay, so these empirical stabilities are lacking in, I mean, do not exist, as far as I can tell, in social modeling. So you don't have this this foundation on which you can build some trust. So this is my first comment. And the second comment is that I maybe we should distinguish between what I would call conceptual and realistic models. So realistic models, I said, you cannot really trust them because you don't have these empirical stabilities, but conceptual models are close to what the example that Bruce gave about tipping points. I always take the example of the Schelling model. Okay, so it's not supposed to be realistic to describe what segregation causes are, or a real segregation of real towns. I mean, I think you should not trust Schelling for that. But what you can trust is the conceptual result that the macro effects of micro causes are not easy to find. So you can, I mean, namely in that example of the segregation Schelling model, is that you can have a mechanism by which people that are willing to live in mixed neighborhoods, even if they really can follow their own utility or their own preferences, collective effects create a segregated town. So the relation between what you see at the global scale and what you can infer or what you can suppose at the individual level is not straightforward. And this is a very important concept that you can derived from a model, and this, I mean, you can trust the model because it's very simple, okay? And it doesn't pretend to describe realistic things, but it helps you thinking, and you can trust models to improve your ways of thinking. So this were my 2 comments.
Okay, thank you. Pascal, you want to react to add your own opinion?
I think that the question is loaded. If I take it as it is, I think we can close this debate because George Box a long time ago with this very famous aphorism summarized the whole thing. All models are wrong. Some of them are useful. Final stop. And that's the end of the debate. Now, where I'm challenging the question is, what are we talking about exactly? For me, a model as such is some kind of inconsequential. But if we look at what makes a model interesting, there's the modeler, there's the set of algorithms, it can be ABM, it can be anything. There's the outputs, and there's the consequences or the outcomes of the output. So how people use these results. And we have to look at the whole continuum. And that's where the question's becoming far more interesting to me, and not looking at the details of, what can we predict. And to put this in, so for me, and like for all of us, I think on this call, knowing more or less all of us, models are metaphors. So if we accept that as a starting point, and we try to disaggregate this continuum of creation, I'm going to give you an example a couple of years ago now, when I was working on drug policy in Australia and creating a model called SimDrug. We had to present some outcome of this model to in Tasmania, in Hobart, in Australia, the output of the model to a room full of high-ranking police officers. I've never seen so many blue uniforms in my life. And so we presented the model, we presented the outputs, and same question can say, how can we trust that? Is this evidence? And the question was put like that to us by police, is this evidence? And my colleagues who were coming from epidemiology and all the domain experts, I was not a domain expert, I was just a modeler, said, yes, you can trust that. And in a quarter of a second, I had to realize that this was a dangerous thing, because the question from these people was, how are we going to use the output of your model as an outcome, as a consequence? And I was the one saying, sorry, I trust my model. I trust the people who helped me, the domain expert who helped me to create the model, but please don't take the outputs as evidence. It is not evidence, and it will never be evidence. So, sorry, it's an answer without being an answer, but I think it's a very, very complicated question that we try to oversimplify most of the time.
Okay, thank you. More or less, according to your different answers, or in this conference in GamaDays, we are more or less in the case where we want to use our models, our agent-based model in particular, in order to make decisions or to take decision, to inform the decision more or less concerning a problem, a public policy or whatever. And my question is this one. More or less, we could have 2 options. It comes just like what you say, Pascal. Can we give models directly to the decision makers in order for them to use it? Or should we communicate something like just like a report according to our models, blah, 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 blah. This is what we learned, and should we be careful when we communicate models, and who are finally our final users of models? Are models only to be used by scientists, or can they be used actually by decision maker, by politicians? I don't know who want to take the lead. Bruce.
Giving a prediction to a policymaker is like giving a sharp knife to a child. someone is going to get hurt and you're going to get blamed. Okay. And it's no good saying, but I told them it was a sharp knife. It's still your fault. Okay. So a lot of the dangers hinted in the last round, what Pablo and Pascal said, comes about confusions about what models can and can't do. So a model can be used for a whole lot of different things, different purposes, as me, Lepage, and other people said in JAS 2019. And just because you can do one of them, you can explain something, or you can provide a counterexample to assumptions, like in the Schelling model, doesn't mean you can do things like predict or something like that. And the enthusiasm of modelers and the language they used is often confuses people in the policy world. They expect you to be able to predict. They want you to predict. They'll put pressure on you to be predict. They'll say, okay, only roughly, that's okay, even if you're going to predict only roughly. But you may not be able to predict at all. And so giving something as complex, either as simplistic as a prediction or as complex as a model to policymakers is useless. I think what my current view is that what we should be doing is, with agent-based models, and given the uncertainty in our domain, is, as I gave the example last time, looking at a possibilistic approach where we're indicating what could possibly go wrong, surprisingly wrong, or in fact surprisingly right, with policies, so that and understanding the processes underneath that. If you're going to give anything to policymakers, give them a visualization of the appropriate data that is revealed to be important when you understand your model. The policymakers, that's relatively transparent what the visualization is doing. The policymakers can use it to reactively react to events very quickly, because they can see the data, they can understand it in a way. The information you've got from analyzing the models goes behind the design of the visualization, but it makes it for something appropriate to hand on to policymakers, and not either too simplistic or too complicated.
Maybe I can add. I mean, I completely agree, and I like this image of the knife. I mean, the most convincing uses of models in policy that I have seen are uses as communication platforms in some sense. I mean, models are there to enhance discussions and maybe manage information and allow information to circulate better, or to be visualized or condensed, or things like this. But they have to be tools to create discussions, to enrich discussions, not to close them. When you give a prediction, it could close the discussion because we know what is going to happen. Okay, so this, for me, at least in social models, because they don't have any legitimacy, because they don't have, I mean, a scientific legitimacy, because there are no empirical stabilities to sum up. So they should really enhance and enrich discussions, not close them. That's to me the key points.
Pascal?
Yeah, I'm with Pablo and Bruce on this one. But probably when Bruce said, you know, we should have never done that. We should have never given the knife to the kids. And I think 30, 40 years ago, when I put a date on it, there was an original scene where we as researchers, even if I was very young at the time, we accepted, because we were very excited, that our fancy models with our more powerful computers could become expert systems. And that day was the day of doom. And we've never ever been able really to get out of it, out of this pit we've been thrown into. One way is definitely participatory modeling. It's probably another debate, and Bruce and Alexi and Fred and many on this call I've been into it, so I won't talk about it. So that's a way to have this consensus that Pablo is talking about, and sharing information. So using the model as a mediating object. Sometimes it's not possible because there's government pressure. So the Imperial College model is a good example for that. In this case, what I try to do is to have knowledge brokers capturing the output of the model to create outcomes. And then I'm very cynical there, and sorry about that for probably the younger colleagues on this call. I hope each time that there will be knowledge brokers from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sides of the equation of the problem at stake, and my model is becoming neutral. But the way they interpret the outputs for a given outcome, that's their problem. It's no longer my problem. I can trust the outputs, but the way they interpret the outputs, it's really their problem for their audience, not mine. And again, it's a very cynical approach. But this is the only way I've been able to reconcile my desire to be objective and neutral, and the model to be objective and neutral, and at the same time knowing that the knives are out there anyway. As soon as we publish the model and the outputs, that's it.
So maybe to complement what Pascal said is that then if the goal here is to enhance discussions and to and to feed them and enrich them, the question maybe we should ask is, aren't formal models, because we are speaking about mathematical models here or simulations, they are kind of knife-ish. I don't know if this is an English word, but I mean they are like intrinsically dangerous because they are linked to what people think are rigorous science, namely mathematics and physics and etc. So maybe intrinsically formal models are dangerous. I'm not saying that they should not be used, but we should really realize that they are intrinsically dangerous because they can be used in a hurting way. So the question is, we know that there are other ways to improve discussions, which are more qualitative by giving, many ways of doing that. So, I mean, why should we stick to formal models for that? And what are their positive sides? And this maybe is a question that Bruce and Pascal can answer, because I don't have that much training with models. I mean, empirical tests of models in that context. And the second question we should ask ourselves, and maybe this is the good and the bad place to do that, is why ABM models specifically? Because I have my intuition is that the more complex the model, the less robust it is. So ABM models, I mean, I have in mind, when I wrote the book, I made a review, I mean, on COVID, and there is a model published in Nature Medicine, which for me was like the counter example of what should be done, which was an ABM model with 194 parameters, because they wanted to be realistic about the epidemics in France. And of course, I mean, since it's difficult to make predictions beforehand, and when you read that paper a few months later, you realize that, I mean, the model was completely off, okay? And it had to be so for me when you have 194 parameters. So to me, the more complexity you put into the model, in general, the less robust they are. And so because maybe the message we should discuss there is that, to me, there is a wrong analogy here between physical and social atoms. We like these ABM models because we trust these individuals, and we have this idea of society emerging from individuals, like atoms. I mean, like matter emerges from atoms, and we have this idea of social atoms. And this is a very bad analogy. And so I explored that in the book. We could discuss that if you want. But I mean, I think that this idea is, I mean, adding more complexity and trusting social atoms is, for me, a bad idea, just in a sentence, because in physics, you can trust atoms because they are stable, okay? The nuclei and the chemical nature of atoms is stable, and then you can trust atoms in all chemical transformation. The atom will not change its chemical nature. But social atoms are going to change. You can never know when a social atom is going to change, and then you cannot build on unstable foundations, and social atoms are unstable. That's my short message.
Bruce, you want to say something?
Yes, please. So it depends on what you want to use a model for. If you want to predict, then having lots of complexity and variables is a bad idea. It makes the predictions inherently unstable. If you want to explain and understand what's happening, it might be a good idea. It's true that you have to constrain your modeling space, that if there's just too much wiggle room, you can fit anything. That is very true. But you don't have to constrain the model space by simplicity. That's a strategy that sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't work. We have no idea when it works, when it doesn't in general, into simple formal models. You can also constrain it by evidence. So if you have evidence for all of these 194 variables, they're not free variables, they are theoretically measurable variables, then that might be the basis for supporting a good explanation. Doesn't prove it's the only explanation, of course.
Don't believe that.
Well, it's something I've argued for a long time, and indeed in my thesis. In terms of formality, just one last point. I mean, to deal with the complexity, you then have a whole wealth of difficult pragmatic issues and difficulties that you need more methodology to deal with. That's certainly true. Simplicity is really helpful to a modeler, makes things easy, not necessarily right. That's undoubtedly true. In terms of formality, from my point of view, formal systems aren't particularly good at representing complex social systems. They're not, I mean, for example, semantic content, we're only just touching upon. We certainly can't do a whole lot of things in formal models that maybe are necessary. But the big advantage of formal models is that they can be passed around and unambiguously checked by a community of researchers. So in a sense, the importance of formal systems is that it makes it a more social project. You don't have to interpret what the person says. You can see it exactly and you can critique it and you say that bit there is wrong. When I say this, I mean this bit. So it actually makes the whole process more social, or opens it up to a social process. And that's incredibly important. Now, of course, in the history of science, it used to be that maths was the only formal system around, and therefore it became associated with science. You can see why. If it's the only game in town for formally representing things, you have a go at it. But in fact, maths has very distinct limitations, certainly analytically solvable maths, and makes it quite a limited tool. Agent-based modeling is far more open, and that causes both its problems and its opportunities. Why agent-based modeling for people? Well, we look around and there are agents around. I mean, in a sense, it's a sort of descriptive step. We see these entities wandering around called agents, so why not have them in your model? Yes, it might not be the correct decision. There might be something else that you should have in your models. You might have social norms as entities, or anything else might be important, but it's just a descriptive step. It's becoming slightly more descriptively realistic as a way of understanding the phenomenon that we're interested in. I think that's enough for me at the moment.
Okay, so I have many things to say, but maybe Pascal wants, I don't want to.
I'm going to try very diplomatically to stay in the middle of the bridge here between Pablo and Bruce, if I can, which is always a very dangerous situation. I think there's a tension, there's been a tension, and there will always be a tension between, and let's call a model again, a metaphor, a replicable, robust, somehow predictive, and most of the time mathematical metaphor, but which is restrictive by definition. And on the other side, something that's tried to become the Lego block game of modeling with as many pieces, with as many colors as possible. And this one is often not that replicable and is very unstable in many instances if it is too complicated. So you have to have a middle ground where everybody's happy, where it's replicable, it's robust enough, it's tractable, and at the same time, it tries to be as realistic as possible. I think with whether mathematical models or pure ABM, as long as we're in that debate, we're going nowhere, because it's a debate we've had. I think that there are papers in JAS many years ago about that, and the debate hasn't evolved. Where we could evolve is what I've tried to do and totally failed so far, because I never got enough data for it, is to have this multi-layered, some kind of nested architecture, where you would have at the bottom your literally, and I agree with Pablo on that one, your Brownian movement on an agent-based paradigm. So these things are just moving around, and don't even try to control them. You can't. So give them as much freedom as possible, but give them boundaries. That's all what you need. On top of that, let's imagine a systems dynamic, for example, paradigm that's going to start at a higher level, binding in boxes and flows the movement of the little guys underneath that try to bang against the wall all the time. And then on top of that, and we're talking here socio-technical systems most of the time, that's the way I frame it. You've got an equivalent of a CG model, computational, computable general equilibrium model. This is the slow inertia of your systems, where these are the rules of engagement of the world you're creating. If we can create back and forth communication between the three layers, then you start binding the world of your Brownian atoms, your agents, into a system that starts to be structured in the middle, and then you've got your major drivers at the top. That for me, that's the dream of the kind of modeling. This would be probably, in terms of computational time, some kind of monster, but at least it would try to get the two viewpoints from Pablo and Bruce in the same architecture.
Okay, so maybe 3 points to have a nice discussion, which provoking a little bit. I like this, and I think we have to be fast enough, because the time is not that long. So first, I like a lot what Bruce is saying, of course, but I would say as a physicist that intuition is a very bad way of doing science. You said we have agents all around, we see them, so why not using them as a basis for simulations? But you know that, in physics, you have many examples of intuitive ways of doing things which were very bad. And so we should really ground scientific models on stable entities. This is what pays, because when you have stable entities, then you can combine them and you can make things. Otherwise, okay, I really don't trust this intuitive grip on society to be trustable for models. Also because I think that this kind of model leads to bad politics. I think that if you put, let's say, little tiny robots, that's what agents are in these models, okay? So this is not a good way of seeing, politically at least, humans. For me, ABM models are a knife-ish too, as a way of seeing. Eleanor Ostrom had a few sentences that I quote in the book, saying that, most simulations assume that only human beings external to those involved, which are scholars and public officials, are able to analyze the situation, ascertain why counterproductive outcomes are reached, etc., etc. So it means that you are in a position of a kind of a god, which is very, in some sense, it's very nice, but it's dangerously nice. Okay, so it's like la libido sciendi, that is not very. You should not trust too much. And so this is the second argument: no stability and bad politics. But then, where I agree with you, Bruce, is that the advantage of mathematics, let's say, or simulation, is that you can share in a more objective way and create a collective. So I agree with that argument, really, for indicators, for example. When you simplify a situation and you say, okay, GDP for a country, for example, or you try to estimate the socioeconomic cost for some ecological project. Okay, you try to put some objective numbers, we all know that they are not good. I mean, they are wrong in many ways. Okay, like the models that, as you said, Pascal, the models are wrong, but some are useful. But okay, so these numbers, these figures that you use to characterize, for example, in France, Notre-Dame-des-Landes, or any good big project, okay? So we know that they are wrong, but they allow a more open and democratic discussion because people have to justify how they reach that number, okay? So this number, the profits are this and this and this, and the disadvantages are this and this, and this is a better way to decide, even if it's not perfect, than just among experts in the secret of some minister, I mean, or some department or whatever, that decide that this has to be done and this not. Okay, so numbers and formal tools are important when they are simple numbers, but I'm less convinced by models because they are too complex in some sense to allow this sharing in a convenient way. So in a kind of paradoxical way, I would say that the simpler is better in some sense. Okay, but this is an important discussion. I like your arguments too, but
Bruce, you wanted to add something.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is a long discussion. We're not going to certainly get to the end of this here. So my first degree was in mathematics at Oxford, and my tutor was James Murray, who writes these big, thick textbooks on using differential equations for modeling biological systems and stuff like that, and used to have lots of discussions with him. And the problem is that what is analytically solvable is very constrained. You have to be really, really experts to be able to cast a problem in terms that are just solvable. And in the process, you make all sorts of approximations whose assumptions and conditions of applicability are really unclear. And so the result of that is that the model becomes, in a sense, more distant from the empirical evidence it relates to. You have more certainty about the content of the model. You understand the model itself, but then you understand less about the relationship between the model and what it represents. Something like ABM is far more descriptive. You understand far less about the model, but it might relate more directly to the measurables that you are attending to. And what is important is the whole loop from the empirical data to the model and back again. And it's the strength of that whole chain that's important. If you just strengthen the analytical bit to weaken the mapping to what it represents too much, then the chain weakens. You can also weaken it by just having a really bad model that you don't understand, like an ABM. So there are several ways of meeting it, and the balance between these is really hard to judge. One approach that I tried with a set of theoretical physicists and sociologists was by making really complex Bruce kitchen sink type models, where it had everything in the model that the sociologists want. You can imagine this. There were 30, 40 different processes in this about why people bother to go and vote. And then once the model was made, we handed it to the physicists. And the physicists, of course, did physicist type thing. They chucked out stuff and they simplified, but they were bound by getting their model, their simpler model, to agree with the complicated model, at least for certain purposes and within certain parameters. So you had they then made another model that simplified that, and another model, an analytic model that simplified that. So we had a whole chain of 4 different models getting simpler on the way up. And so the disadvantage of that, it takes ages to do. The advantage of that is you're always comparing models, which is really good because you learn a lot more about your models, and that the steps of abstraction are more gentle. You're not making this sudden leap to a really abstract maths model, but you're staging the abstraction so that the what is represented in the layer below is clearer. And thus you have some sort of compromise between simplicity and descriptive accuracy in the chain, but then you're trying to maintain a whole chain of models. So it's very much more work. It took us about 5 years to get through this completion. We were learning as we were doing, of course, but it took a long time to do. But maybe new methodologies like that are necessary to do that. So that might be a way around it. And of course, going back to that story at the beginning, yes, agent-based models may be sharp, but maths is much sharper. And yes, it can be simpler, but it involves a lot more technical ability to understand maths and its assumptions. While a simulation, the mapping to what it represents can be far more common sense. This is one person, this is an interaction, this is like that. So in some senses, it's less open, and in some senses, it's more open to critique by policymakers and other people. That's enough.
Pascal, you want to react?
Yeah, I really like what Bruce just presented. Just back to Pablo, I think there's a slight bias in your argument, Pablo, where you compare your atoms. Yeah, we know all of them, and then you jump, so mathematics and atoms, and then agent-based modeling and people. It's ooh, bad. I'm sorry, mathematical models that talk about people are as bad as agent-based models. That's something I've always argued upon. Why are we always picking on agent-based modeling about validation, calibration, Monte Carlo, blah, 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 where all the mathematical models are as wrong as? But for a different reason. I agree with you, they're very robust, they're tractable and replicable, point taken, but there's a price to pay for that. And I've been working with people working with CGE models, as I mentioned already, for quite a long time now. The black box, the nasty hidden black box happens before the model starts. The choices made by the modelers about the variables you have to take into account. And we're no longer talking about atoms and molecules here. We're talking about people. And when you see the way CGE models are designed, I'm sorry, but there's a lot to say as well about how realistic they are and how much we can trust them.
Yeah, but then, I mean, that's often an argument that I hear from people from ABM. They say that the rest is worse. I mean, I was expecting positive arguments, not negative ones.
No, I'm not saying worse. I'm saying as bad as.
Well, as bad as. But then, if mathematics is bad and ABM is as bad as mathematics, then it means that ABM is bad too. No, okay, I agree. But jokes. Maybe the problem with ABM is then that it gives you the illusion to have a good formal handle on things, while at least mathematics doesn't give you the illusion of understanding something, because that's even worse. Maybe to be more serious.
Yes, it's certainly true. It's certainly true that agent-based models can be far more convincing than they really have merit for. They can look convincing. The verisimilitude, the sort of surface similarity can be very deceptive. Mm-hmm. And maths doesn't have that because it's incomprehensible to most people from the year dot. And so they've developed socially, lies, damn lies, and statistics. They've developed socially a distrust. What's this guy doing? It's usually a guy. He might have hidden something in this complicated maths. And we haven't developed yet those social instincts with respect to agent-based modeling. It's the new kid on the block. And hopefully that will develop. And its particular dangers and abilities. They're different tools. They have different pros and cons. So they should be used for different purposes.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, you say what we put as a hypothesis in the mathematics, Pascal, is very ugly in this CG models. But I mean, you also have to make assumptions in ABM models, and they may look more, less constrained, but I'm not sure that they are better. First, so I wanted to give a positive appreciation on ABM models, but not to be. However, is that because physicists use some kind of ABM models also to compare to economics, and I say that what is nice about ABM models, at least, is that at least you get out of this equilibrium idea in economics. So it enriches. I'm back again to this, the models should enrich the discussion. So when you introduce ABM models, I'm not sure that they are better than in general than the equilibrium models, but at least they show you that equilibrium is not the only game in town. I mean, you can think in an, I mean, it can make you more cautious about equilibrium and think in a different way, even if it's not more trustable than equilibrium, but at least it enriches the discussion. So this is a positive aspect of ABM models, but I'm still back on the more conceptual issues. So I trust these models as a conceptual way of enriching our think, and we agree with Bruce on many issues, but I'm still not convinced about the positive side of realistic ABM models. So Bruce, if you had, and Bruce and Pascal, can you both of you give what in your eyes is the best proof of a realistic ABM model that that should convince me that they are really worth exploring and they are much better than mathematical models? Can you on the chat maybe give a reference to some what is the model?
Let's put it in another way, because time is running as well. Maybe if you get a takeaway message for, especially for Gamma development team, actually they are providing a lot of efforts in order to provide tools to enrich models, either with data, for instance, integrating geographical data, generating a synthetic population for the models, either a lot of effort also on visualization, on providing, let's say, different grammars in order to build different models. What should they do? Should they go ahead with this development, or should they go back to more analytical tools and some kind of tools in order to prove something with the models or to find properties?
Okay, well,
You're a Gamma user. Not yet.
I think that of course maths is a valuable tool, but those immersed in maths, just like those immersed in ABMs or any other tool, in fact, like that, tend to see the world through it, and they get so used to using it that they are to some extent blind as to the difficulties of their own technique. I hear lots of phrases from mathematicians when I inject them. Well, it gives insight into the core dynamics or something like that. You know, yes, it gives you insight, but you have no idea whether it's the correct core dynamics, okay? Because you made so many assumptions. So you've got to be really careful. And that's why this sort of layered things like that. If you want to understand a certain aspect and you got it in a model, that's a much better target for aiming maths at. And if you've got an agent-based model, aim your maths at that model, because you can measure it, you can check the assumptions, you can do experiments to check your simplifications and your approximations hold. You can do all these things, and then your maths is far better grounded in what it's trying to represent, and the model should be doing the representative bit. So we're separating out the representation for the agent-based modeling and the abstraction in the next step.
Pascal?
Sandra, I realize it's a bit late, 5 minutes before the end, that this is probably an old debate, and I don't want to misguide somehow, again, the younger generation on this call. I think the last generation of models that have been developing or I've read about, they're already integrating within an ABM architecture and within a platform like Gamma, you can incorporate mathematics whenever, wherever relevant and as much as possible. I can remember the model we created with colleagues here in Australia about coral reefs around the world. all the biology of the reefs and the marine environment was driven by differential equations and very sophisticated interactions, but there was a cellular automaton that were taking care of the current. So we tried to bring at the same level, so it was not a nested model I've already described, but at the same level, the best of the two worlds. And all the socioeconomics were taken care of by an agent-based model, very simple, not realistic at all, Pablo, I recognize that. I designed it, so I can say it was not realistic, but this was the minimum viable we needed to make the mathematical models at the level of the environment a bit more realistic in their behavior in response to constraints and shocks.
So I don't use Gamma, so I'm not very good at giving advice, but I would just give to general advice is driven, but from other experience as a physicist. First, think twice before introducing any new parameter or complexity into your model, because this could be the one that leads you astray, and to introduce noise instead of signal because of many things. And second, as we started, maybe is that don't trust too much your model, and above all, don't use the formal side to pretend having scientific legitimacy. Okay, so be careful about that, because what is out of the model is never more certain than all the hypotheses you made, and even it's like a multiplying effect of all the uncertainties and noise that you put into. Okay, so be careful about that, and that's all I can say. And I do not longer actually make social models because maybe I think too much.
Okay, sorry, I have to end the discussion. You could have stayed for far longer. Maybe the takeaway message.
We could have gone on for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. Yes,
it would have been a pleasure still.
Thanks a lot for.
Maybe the takeaway message is a message I would give to my kids as well. Don't trust strangers. Maybe don't trust models as well. Thank you, Ennio, for all of you three for participating to this roundtable. If you can stay around for the conference, it would be great. And probably dealing with the conference in 2 minutes, you get the next session starting. I don't know what it is, but probably Patrick knows. If Patrick is somewhere.
Yeah, it's not me that is going to chair the session, so I'm not sure about but I can find. Sorry. So the next one will be about transportation and mobility, and